Hello, welcome to another episode of Effective Teaching and Learning Institute. We've done several sessions so far on the concept of direct instruction. In our last episode, we used what we called the plenaries and starters, and we even asked that you predict what we're going to do today. I guess you did a try, and you can tell that we are looking at the concept of presentation during direct instruction. I am Kwadwo, and on the other side is my colleague Kwesi. We've already looked at the key elements of direct instruction. We've said that direct instruction encompasses these 7 essential steps, that is having a learning objectives, having a success criteria, having a starter, and then we added the plenary the last time. Then looking at the presentation, and then having guided practice, and then also what you call independent practice, what the learners can also do on their own, and then we call the plenaries the same as the closure. In today's session, we want to look at another very essential part of the elements of direct instruction called presentation. And we target I do. I do in the sense that it is the part where the teacher now gets the chance to take over, lead the instruction, and make sure that the students are a part of it. We've been doing several discussions on direct instruction, but I'm sure there are still doubts in our mind. So, Kwesi, if you can help us with having a clear definition of what direct instruction is, so that we can then zoom it in onto presentation.
All right. So, if we look at it, there's an institute for direct instruction in the US called the National Institute for Direct Instruction. They have done a lot of research and work and come up with different teaching practices in reference to making direct instruction more authentic or effective. And they define direct instruction as a module for teaching. So direct instruction is a teaching module. And in this module, it says that it emphasizes well-developed and carefully planned lessons, which are designed around small learning increments. So you design the lessons in small bits, in small steps, with clearly defined and prescribed teaching tasks. But the whole idea is based on the understanding that if students are given clear instructions, that can improve and accelerate their learning with the possibility of eliminating any possibility of misinterpretation. So they are looking at direct instruction as a teaching module, which if you look at a typical lesson plan, it follows that particular module, where you have the beginning of the lesson, the middle point, the main activity, and the closing aspect of the lesson. And the main learning activities clearly are defined as the I do part, where the teacher teaches, and then we do part, where the teacher engages the students in guided practice. And then you do part, where the students are then allowed, after they have mastered the concept, allowed to engage in independent practice. So that is what they mean by small learning increments. So it starts with the teacher, and then there's a release of responsibility to the student after they have really mastered the concept very well, before students are allowed to engage in independent practice work.
All right. I think this casts the background for our discussion today, which is looking at the concept of presentation, the part where the teacher then takes center stage and guide the students through their learning. Let's start by looking at what effective teaching is then in the context of presentations. What is effective teaching?
When we talk about effective teaching, I think one thing that is so obvious about it is that it's so difficult to define, but it's easy to recognize. I mean, you don't have to be an educator to recognize that effective teaching happening in the classroom. Parents recognize it, students recognize it.
Everyone can tell there's very good teaching happening.
Exactly, everyone.
And if it's not good, they can all tell.
Exactly. So that is something that is very unique about it. Even though there's no clear definition or an agreed definition, universal definition on what makes an effective teaching. but we all know the key or the critical features of effective teaching. But there's a few that we know about effective teaching from research. And if you look at the visible learning research, that
John Hattie's
research, where a number of educational literature examining different teaching practices that are known to be working or effective as far as students' learning is concerned. They outline that direct instruction is one of the effective teaching methods, right? And if you look at John Hattie's research, it indicates that if a child spends a year in a teacher's class where effective practices are used, then it's likely that the child will have an effect size of 0.4 or more. So 0.4 is a desired effect. That means that the child spends a year there and is grown in his learning at least 1 year more. So they registered a year growth.
I'm 1 year better because I've been in your class.
Exactly. So, but if you are not using best practices or good practices, then it will be less than 0.4. So you see on the right side where
I've been worse off being in your class in that case.
Yeah, so if you are getting negatives, it means that it's better the student did not even show up in school. The child will be better off without schooling, where you have negative effects. But from all the literature that he examined and studied, it was clear to him that effective direct instruction does have a positive impact on students' learning, and the effect size is 0.69. From that research, his conclusion about effective instruction.
You meant 0.59.
0.59, yeah. And he concluded that for effective teaching to occur, as he was describing direct instruction, it is when the teacher decides on the learning intentions and the success criteria. I remember these are two very key components of direct instruction. And then it says that when the teacher decides on the learning intentions and success criteria and make it transparent to the learners or to the students. And we talked about sharing this to students knowing what they are supposed to be learning and able to recognize whether they have been successful with their learning. And then if the teacher is able to demonstrate them by modeling, which is a key focus of our lesson discussion today, by looking at how teachers present the content to students. So he says that if they can do this by modeling and at the end evaluate if the students have understood what they have been taught by checking for understanding and retelling them what they have been told by tying it all together with a plenary or closure. You remember we did a starter and a plenary, right? So he says that if this thing is happening in a class, then effective instruction is happening. And that is a clear description of what direct instruction really is about. And from the many literature that he examined, he concludes that direct instruction is one of the methods that, if combined with other strategies, does have a great impact or positive impact on students' learning.
All right, and that means that we can never continue to demonize direct instruction, because from even the research here, we are clear that it has a high effect size. 0.59 is a very good effect size if we are even using direct instruction alone. And like you have said, if we activate all the key elements of effective teaching in direct instruction, then we are likely to even amplify the effect size that we are getting. Now, how then do we as teachers ensure that students become responsible for their own learning? How do we ensure that presentations that we do are effective then?
All right. If you look at the work of Douglas and Nancy in their book, Better Learning Through Structured Teaching, which kind of relates to the idea of direct instruction module. They call their principle, the module, the gradual releasing of responsibility for learning from the teacher to the student. What this means is that, in every classroom, is a teacher that decides, for example, on what the students are going to learn. The
Yeah.
teacher is more knowledgeable about the subject content than the student.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that before a lesson starts, the teacher has or assumes all the responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But they are saying that for there to be effective learning to happen in a class, or for you to recognize effective learning, you should see a release of that responsibility from the teacher to the student. But that release of that responsibility should be done gradually. And they talk about 4 key things, phases, that this release of responsibility moves from the teacher to the learner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from that module, they came up with 4 different descriptions of classrooms with some 4 distinct instructional approaches. So let me just walk us through the 4 approaches. You know, the first one they talked about is that in some classrooms, there is independent learning where the students do all the work. You do it all alone.
Wow.
And this falls under the ideas of inquiry-based learning. Under the guise of inquiry-based learning, some teachers think that they have to just give the entire responsibility to students. The idea of constructivism, not properly understood, brings teachers to this kind of understanding that the students have to do all the work. So students have a lot of worksheets, they have a lot of text that they are seeking to understand and make meaning out of it, and all of that. They do this all independently. And that is one of the classes rooms that do not lead to better outcomes for everyone within the classroom. The second classroom with a different instructional approach. Here, I think that is a typical Ghanaian classroom.
Yeah.
Where the teacher teaches, that is
just
focused instruction. The teacher teaches, and then he gives the students work to do.
Yeah.
Right. So the teacher will give the instruction. At times, they even do the easy part of the task. And then they give you the difficult one for the students to
I guess the sector shows the quantity of work the teacher will do. Exactly. You see the smaller triangle up there. Exactly, I do 8 parts.
Yeah.
The teacher does a little of it.
Yeah, so he gives the instruction, he does the explaining, presents the content to you, and then gives you a lot of work to do all by yourself without a teacher guiding you. There is no guided practice in this example. And then it gives us a third class where you might find a lot of students doing well, doing good in this class. But in this class, the teacher will present the content, teach the content with a clear purpose, the success criteria, all that. But the teacher will engage in a brief guided instruction for those that need it. And then he leaves it out to the students to wrestle with the independent practice. But this is what Douglas and Nancy believe. Yeah, I believe that should be the class where learning is enabled and extended for everybody. And in their description of the gradual release of learning responsibility from the teacher to the student, they think that it should happen through these 4 different phases of instruction or learning. Right. So the first phase, like in every class, where the teacher I do part, the teacher demonstrates it, modules it through moduling, shows the students how to write the essay, how to solve the math problems, how to perform the experiment, how to offer explanations, how to make an argument, all the skills that students are seeking to learn and the understanding that they are seeking to develop in the class, the teacher modules that through a focused instruction. And then he guides the students to do same. He gives a similar task to the students through the guided instruction. We do it together with the student. And then there's the we do part, but the third we do part is more collaborative, where you do it together. The students themselves then engage in the task. So for example, if a teacher is teaching you how to perform or write a conclusion like we did the last time for a lab report, the teacher will do it through focused instruction. And then the teacher will guide the students to do it. The third phase, the teacher then pairs students to work together and perform the same task, not a different task, a same task, do it together. And lastly, the teacher then gives individual students the responsibility to write their own conclusion for a lab report. So you see the phases where this comes through, where it starts with the teacher, and then the teacher, again, through guided practice and through supervision, pairing students to work together. They will practice that skill or try to master that understanding or acquire the knowledge. And lastly, the student will then come to the level of mastery where they do it all alone. So you see, it doesn't move from the teacher to doing it alone straight away, but it starts with the teacher, again with the teacher working with the student, and thirdly, the teacher then allows students to work to help each other, that is activating the students as resource for each other, and finally, students engage in guided practice. So the fourth classroom, the kind of instructional module for the fourth classroom, is a classroom where learning really occurs. But the three other modules that we looked at, where there's independent practice, do it alone, or where there's a limited instruction by the teacher and the teacher gives you all the time to engage in do it alone practice time, or the third classroom where I do it, the teacher do it, and then we do it together through guided practice. And finally, he doesn't give the students opportunity to work in groups, but then transfer the tasks again to an independent practice. Those classes, effective and meaningful learning, do not occur for every child in that class. Okay. But if you want to extend and enable learning for every child, then it has to be follow the module of the gradual release of responsibility from I do it to we do it, where you and the teacher and the students are doing it. And then thirdly, where the students are doing it, trying their hands on it. And lastly, where the students do it all alone by themselves.
I think gradually we are trying to establish by our discussions that direct instruction is not wholly teacher-centered as we have been made to believe. Yes. That now, although the teacher has some responsibility, you gradually have to release that responsibility to the students through you doing it, guiding the students to also do it, then letting them have the opportunity to do it with their peers before they do it alone, so that they don't get totally confused because they are working alone. Neither do they just become passive because you are the man in action and everyone else have to just sit and listen to you. Are there any principles that underpin presentations as far as direct instruction is concerned?
All right, so focusing on the I do part, there are some principles for effective instruction. Rosensheim, Baruch Rosensheim have some 10 principles. Actually, he has 17 principles, but in his article, which is being referenced in the slide, he discussed them in 10 principles, which are very important for practicing effective direct instruction, which the 4 classroom modules that we saw from Nancy and Douglas, Better Learning in a Structured Environment book also speaks to. And it also speaks, this principle also speaks to the 7 steps of direct instruction, which John Hattie's research also reveals that if teachers say they are using direct instruction, this is how they have to do it. But why they have to do it that way is the 10 principles that Rosensheim actually brings. And it starts with the first one, that begin a lesson with a short review of previous learning. Yeah. Right? You cannot start teaching somebody when you don't know what the person already knows. You can only build from what people know. And that is why we talked about the starter and the plenary for reviews. And then presenting new ideas in chunks instead of telling them everything and then giving them work to do. But if you have a 30 minutes presentation or instruction to give, You rather have to chunk it up depending on the concentration span of your learners. If you're teaching in a high school, if you have a 30 minutes presentation, then you have to do 10 minutes interspersed with practice work for your learners. So don't present all of them at a go, but present them in small steps. And then ask a lot of questions to check your students' understanding. That is one principle. The third principle. The fourth principle is that teachers have to show. Just telling somebody or talking. Teaching is not talking. Right? Teaching is not talking. I mean, that's one thing that we need to, because that's what people think direct instruction is about. Just talking, informing, and presenting ideas to someone. But it's more than that. It's actually about explaining. When we talk about presenting, we are talking about explaining ideas and concepts to students. And when you explain, it's better you explain with modules, with concept maps, with mind maps, with some visuals, right? Modeling, showing them how to do it, some demonstrations. And then you have to guide students through practice. You have to provide guided practice. Don't just teach or even show them how to do it and just ask them to do it. Once you have shown them how to do it, the next thing that you have to do is to help the students to do it the first time, right? Because, I mean, all of us know when we're starting writing essays or solving math problems, the teacher has explained it all right, I've shown you how to do it. But when you say solve question 1, it will take you some time to start, right? It takes you some time. So that tells you that for there to be effective learning, the teacher has to move from demonstration to let me help you start. And that is a guided practice, right? Solving it with a student, a number of questions, till they now begin to have the confidence to start working. And once you present and do all this, it's important you check for students' understanding. But the whole idea is to ensure that there's a greater level of success for every learner, right? This approach of direct instruction is to ensure that all the students succeed. To accelerate learning and the performance of students. So this approach is about creating confident and successful learners. That's what it's about. So when you do all this and you check for understanding, you are actually preparing for every child in the class to succeed. And next week, when we talk about the practice one, people understand why it's important to obtain a high rate of success for learners. Don't give students difficult tasks. Do the easy tasks in the class and give students difficult tasks as homework. That is not effective instruction. Effective instruction provide hints, clues, support system, a lot of support for students to engage in difficult tasks. So provide scaffolds for students to be able to perform complex and difficult tasks. And through all of this, it is important for you to require and monitor independent practice work to see whether students have really mastered the concept or whether there's a need for reteaching. And the 10th principle is that when you have taught in small steps, ask a lot of questions, check students' responses, you have done a lot of demonstrations, you have guided students through a lot of practice, you've checked for the understanding, and all of this culminating in showing that students are successful with their learning. You're providing a lot of support for students to be successful in solving difficult tasks or completing difficult tasks. And once you've checked that students have succeeded and have mastered the content, you've provided opportunity for them to engage in independent practice. It is important that you do weekly and monthly reviews. You know, teachers will teach and teach for months, be more than a month, and then they come up with a test. And they wonder why students don't succeed with that. It's important that you do weekly reviews and monthly reviews. So if you are reviewing what students are learning on a weekly basis, that is by engaging students in independent practice of a sort, whether it's a test, whether it's a homework, any forms of assessment where students are doing it by themselves. And then on a monthly basis, you are reviewing what students have learned. Then you are really preparing your students for, you're creating an environment for effective and meaningful learning to happen. So these are the 10 principles, and as we move on the discussion, we'll see how this is illustrated in the DI module, which is Direct Instructional module that we have been talking about.
All right. I think it makes it quite clear here that you cannot just put the students into the space of learning and just say, I've finished my part, do your part, and let's get on with it. It doesn't work that way. No. And a concept, the 10th principle is what strikes me the most, that the reason why students mostly fail when we have done our instruction is because we do not engage in weekly or monthly reviews. And then we expect that I've finished teaching you, yours is to go and do the learning. And so when I give you a test, if you fail, it means you did not study. But a child may be studying and yet may be having challenges in getting through and understanding these things that we want them to do. All right, now let's look at the presentation. Are there some key considerations that we need to follow in effective instruction as far as the presentation part? You mentioned presentation, you mentioned some other things, I think modeling and then checking. Can you take us through what we need to be considering when we are doing the presentation?
All right, so if you look at what we've just talked about so far, the direct instructional module, right? You'll see that we talked about begin the lesson by reviewing, that is a starter. And we said that at ending the lesson, there has to be another review.
Yes.
And then there is a starter to really, I've talked about a starter to prepare students up for the presentation of the new idea.
Yeah.
And that presentation of new idea is the I do part where the teacher supply his or her input, what he knows about osmosis, diffusion, verbs, adjectives, numbers, fractions, differentiation, integration, all the things that teachers know that they teach students and students are supposed to be learning. The I do part is where the teacher actually shows it or presents it.
Yeah.
But it will strike you to note that if you look at the entire lesson as a whole, only 10 to 15% of the entire lesson time is actually spent on, in an effective direct instruction, is spent on the I do part. And about 80+% of the time is actually involved with students applying and reviewing what the presentation was about. Okay, so if you are really doing this very well, so that means that when you look at the I do part, there are 3 things that we can talk about. The teacher presents the information or provides the information, and presenting the information or providing the information is not enough until you have shown the information. The information has to be visible, right? It has to be visible. And then you check for understanding. You monitor students' success as to how they are learning. So this is how you have to present. This is the 4th stage. And that's what I'm saying, that this stage takes only 10 to 15 minutes of the entire instructional time. So
you mean the presentation part?
The presentation part.
Okay.
And students have to be engaging the rest of the lesson, which is about more than 80% of the time, really applying what you have taught them and reviewing what you have taught them in the plenary as well. Applying what you've taught them in the guided practice, in the I do part, independent practice time. That is what the teacher has to provide opportunity for. And if you look at what we saw from Douglas and Nancy's book, Better Learning, you'll see that the 3 other classes that do not provide a good opportunity for learning to happen for a number of kids, clearly reveals that teachers spend unnecessarily a lot of times on I do part, and give students very limited opportunity to engage in a lot of practice time.
I see.
Right, so the I do part, there are three ways: presenting the information and showing the information and monitoring whether the information has been learned by the student.
Okay.
All right, so let's look at the presenting part.
Okay.
You know, expert teachers are pretty much aware about the limitations of our working memory. You know, that is where most of our information is processed. And every expert teacher knows that the working memory is very small. So if you present a lot of information to people at a given time, or students at a given time, you're actually going to overwhelm them and confuse them, and that will not enable learning. So what expert teachers have in their class is that they have a clear procedure of presenting information in small amounts. And that was what Rosenshine's presentation principle is about. The second principle says that you have to present information or new materials in small steps. Right? And expert teachers support this research, or knows this research is the key, because they know the limitation of the working memory, where students actually process the information we give them, right? So, and that is why most expert teachers present information in small bit, and then they engage students in guided learning practice time, so that students can master the information that is given to them. So one of the effective ways of doing this is presenting by using examples.
Okay.
And an instructional method strategy that you can use for this is what we call the visual instructional plan. And this is an example about how to teach students to draw a hexagon. Okay, so step one, so you can see that there is visual and there is what? Instruction. So the teacher will say that select
the length of a side.
The length of a side. The teacher is showing a visual by drawing it, the line, the side of the length of a side. And then he says, set the compass to that length. And there is a visual supporting the words that the teacher is presenting. So whatever you are teaching, if you can add visuals to it, okay, research shows that it really has a high effect on students' learning. So using a mind map, using a concept map to support the things that you are presenting. So don't just say it auditorily, but think about ways that you can show the things that you are presenting, or the content that you are presenting to the student. Some teachers do it through videos. Some teachers do it through a short film for students. And you can also do it through graphics, like we're talking about, or graphic organizers, or mind maps, or concept maps can be used, or the use of the visual instructional plan as well. So these are instructional practices that we can use. Another approach is presenting with a lot of questions.
Okay.
Jeff Petty has this particular literature on the 25 ways of teaching without talking.
Okay.
It's without talking. And he talks about teaching by asking questions. Okay, so you are presenting information to students. You can have a lot of questions about that text that you could ask about the text, right? And use the questions to guide the students in actually learning that particular content that you want to give them to the students. So that is what it means, that's why you can teach. And you can also guide students to actually learn to ask questions by giving them this question prompts. And that is what Rosenshine's actually recommends, that effective teachers from their research actually give students a lot of prompts to ask questions, so that as they present, the students will rather be writing a lot of questions about what they are presenting in order to have a deeper understanding of the explanations that the teachers are giving. And these are examples of question prompts that students can use to ask critical questions about a content that teachers present to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think what you just said on a presentation really shows that if we are clear in how we intend to do the presentation, then it calls for a lot of planning, and that we cannot just have the students go through our lessons and then things happen accidentally. It will not result in learning. Now, the second part, which is the modeling, is what even struck me, that we need to model what we present, the information we give to the students. How do we do that?
Yes. This is a very important way of presenting information to students, right? And again, we're based on the research of Rosenshine, that he says that many of the skills that we teach in a classroom can easily be done by just providing prompts, modeling the prompts, the use of the prompts, and guiding students as they develop independence. Right, so it's talking about providing a prompt, showing them how to do it, guiding them, and supervising them as they do it. Right, so let's look at an example here. Let's say you want students to, like in English, reading comprehension, right? Teacher has given a comprehension passage and it has a number of questions that students have to use to really understand the particular text. So what a teacher can do with this is that the teacher can show the students how to ask questions by giving text. And here a text can be anything. It can be like a literature. It can also be a diagram. It can be a table, right? It can be a solved math question.
It can be a picture.
Exactly. It can be a photograph, a picture of something that the students are learning about. So what a teacher would do is that he modules how to ask questions using a question prompts like who, where, why, and how.
Okay.
Right. And using that question prompts to actually obtain the very salient information about that text. Okay. Once the teacher modules that, he has to guide the students to also read the text using their own generated question prompts to pick out the key information from a given text. That is one way you can present a text. So for example,
this time you are thinking about the text. That's why it's called think aloud.
Exactly. So thinking aloud means that the teacher is showing them how to do that. Okay, so an example that I was going to give is that if I'm an economics teacher and I'm teaching the concept of demand, which is a more easier concept, you might have some literature, some text about this concept of demand. The determinants of it, its definition, the determinants of it. And you can use a question prompt to ask a lot of questions about that given notes on the idea of demand. And based on the questions you raise, you will have answers from the text. And that will give you an insight into what is demand, what factors influence it, how does it influence the demand. So that's the questions you ask. And when you read the text, you'll get all that information from that given text.
Yeah.
Right? So once the teacher modules that, then the teacher can give the student a different text, right? And the degree of difficulty of the text can vary depending on the student's readiness level or attainment levels within the class in terms of processing information. And that is one way of differentiating the instruction for students. And the students will use their generated questions to also pick out very salient information. So again, it comes back to the idea of Jeff Petty saying you can teach without talking, right? Because you've given the students, everybody, a copy of the text, and you have shown them how to use your own self-generated questions to pick out the most salient information from that given text in making your own notes, for instance, all right? So this is, the teacher will show them how to do it, and whilst he's demonstrating it, he has to say it in such a way that the students will know how he's thinking about generating the questions, how he's thinking about using the questions to find the right information from the text, so that when the students are also going to do it, it will be easier for them to engage in a similar activity in order to pick out the key information. Another way for modeling is using worked examples, right? So you can use examples that are good or bad examples for students to solve a question. Or you can use worked examples that are complete worked examples or partially complete one, like the one in the slide here.
Yeah.
So if you look at example 1, it's completed, but in example 2, they've done everything. The only part that is left is the addition part.
Addition. Yeah.
Right? But look at example 3. It has some level of challenge. The students have to do the multiplication and the addition as well. Some part of the multiplications have been done for the student.
Yeah.
But a greater part of the students then also have the opportunity to practice the multiplication and the addition. So in example 1, they are only practicing addition. In example 2.
So Kwesi,
yes.
If I get this, I'm really struck by this example. Yeah. What we are saying is that as I present the information on how to do this, I should model it. And in modeling it, I may get to a point where I show them some partially completed example for them to deduce the steps they have to go through and then use those steps to complete the others. Is that what we're trying to say here?
Yes, so that is in example 1. In example 1, you go through the entire steps and you complete the task for them to see how it is done.
Okay, with the students.
Right. Yes, and at times it's even important that a teacher writes, whilst you are modeling, you write each of the steps, the steps that you went through. Okay, so once you've solved the problem, which is becomes a work example, then the rest of the examples will be partially completed tasks, like the example 2 to 5, and then the students are then asked to be engaged in solving them. But I wanted you to see the degree of difficulty.
Yes.
Over here, that in example 1, they are only practicing addition.
Yes.
In example 3, they are practicing multiplication and they are doing some addition. Right? And then they are doing more multiplication and additions in example 4.
Yeah.
But you see there, over there, the addition sign has been omitted. There's something that has been faded. So the students have to figure out that he needs to add at that stage after completing all the multiplication tasks that is involved here. And then the last one, this is the independence. That is the independence, right? So after they have gone through the guided process, they now have to be able to complete a task by themselves, just as the teacher started with in example 1. So that is one way of modeling how to do things and taking students through guided practice. And I think next week we'll talk more about student practice and making sure that you create a lot of opportunity for students to practice what you teach them, right? Before you can say that you really taught and that learning has happened. If you don't give students a lot of practice time, then maybe you taught, but it doesn't guarantee that learning has happened, right? So these are two ways of presenting information using modeling, by thinking aloud, showing students how to do it, or by giving students work examples. And there's been research to support that in some effective teachers class, students just looked at examples, solved examples, and they use it to solve similar problems.
Yeah.
Without anybody
teaching them.
Exactly. So if we make sure that we have a solved example with a clear written steps, then the students can look at it and also be able to engage in a similar task and solve that.
How about situations whereby teachers say this modeling approach of work examples can only be done in mathematics?
Not necessarily. So here we unfortunately we use an example of math here, but in language they are writing essays, is that
yes,
not?
Yeah.
So you might not be able to. You shouldn't module the entire essay writing, but you can module the how to write the introduction. You can module how to write the main body of the essay, and then you can module how to write the conclusion. And even with the main body, you can module how to put the paragraphs together to write the full essay before you conclude that, right? So once you show them with an example, or even an essay that your previous students have written, that is of good, or even if it is history questions that your past students have written, or in writings in economics, in geography, or solved questions in chemistry and physics that past students have done that were really good examples of how to solve the question. You as a teacher can add the steps on how the student actually came up with that product. And then you can use that to show students how to do it. So that is something that a lot of teachers don't really rely on their own students' sampled work. Right? But it's a very useful resource for instructing your students effectively. It's a very useful resource.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I think one of the other steps is to check them after you've done the presentation, after we've modeled it, is to check for understanding. Now, how do we do that also?
You know, that's a very important aspect of presenting. A lot of teachers check for understanding after everything is done. But we are saying that when you present ideas, content, and you even module, show them how the content look like for students to fully understand it, you have to check whether they have learned it. Right? Whilst the learning is happening, whilst the instruction is going on, you have to be checking whether students have mastered it or not. Right? And I think next week it will be clear how to transition from I do to we do, guided practice, and how we can transition into an independent practice. And you realize that a number of classes, teachers have to go back and reteach the entire curriculum because
the whole show.
Because they have
no wonder we get this annoying refrain from students. Right, the whole show.
Yes.
You went to the end.
They have taught, but learning has not happened. And I'm sure when we look at the guided practice, we'll see that for learning to happen, it takes a lot of work, right? And the reason we need to check for understanding whilst the learning is happening is for the purpose of elaboration. You know, when somebody have learned something, the way they can show that they've learned it is to how they are able to elaborate, expand on what they have already been acquired, right? And it's very important that we give students opportunity to do that. The second reason is for students to be able to make connection, right? If students can connect what they are learning with something they already know, then it clearly demonstrates to you that they have understanding of it. And connection is very important for meaningful learning to happen, or to ensure that there is mastery, and even retention of the ideas or the information that you are presenting. And the last reason we need to check is that we need to check if learning has not happened, then we need to reteach. All right. Okay. So, and it's not like teaching them everything, but if you check well, you'll be able to know which aspect of the new material that needs to be retaught. Okay. So these are the reasons for rechecking, checking students' understanding. But there are several ways of doing this. I mean, tons of ways of checking students' knowledge.
We don't do you understand?
No. I mean, when we're discussing the learning objectives, it was clear that because your lesson have a clear learning intention, saying that do you understand is not appropriate. Do you understand what? It has to be in reference to the learning objective. Okay, and that is how you should check using any of these instructional approaches. So you can even ask students, for example, to think aloud, to module for you to see, maybe solving a math problem, planning an essay, identifying the main idea in a paragraph or in a text. If they can do that, if that's what you're working on, if you can help students, if you can give students opportunity to show whether they can do any of this, to show that they have achieved the learning intention, that is one way of checking. Not at the end of the lesson. I mean, through the we do part, through the I do part, the independent practice and the guided practice, you should be checking understanding. One thing that I like doing, especially when you are dealing with multiple choice. Okay, if you are assessing students using multiple choice, one thing I ask students always to do is to explain the answer and defend their position or defend their position. So if students solve the question, maybe somebody is A to D and they chose A and the A is the wrong answer, but C is correct. What I normally do with students is that don't accept that you are wrong. Never accept that you are wrong, because you chose A and you have a reason. So let the people hear you. So when I pair them up, I pair the students up, and then maybe their pair they even got it wrong. Maybe they also said it's a B, and the other person said it's an A, but the answer is C, based on the math scheme. I will force them to defend their answer.
Okay.
And that is very important, because I've seen that once they are defending their answer, then all the misconception comes out. And as they keep arguing, the interesting part is that the two of them who have the wrong answer and are defending it now begin to realize that they started on the wrong premise. So they see the error that they actually made, and they are now begin to see that C is the correct response to that particular question.
So you are not quick to tell them what the correct answer is?
Not at all. But you have to defend it. But you need to find somebody who has the correct answer and explain to you why he thinks or she thinks that answer is correct. But never accept that you are wrong. Because you chose that response with a
based
reason.
On your understanding.
Exactly. So let your misconception be heard so that you can be corrected.
Okay.
So that is a very important process that teachers can use in helping them, their learners, to really demonstrate their learning and their understanding. You can use an exit ticket when students have mastered and engaged in an independent practice of a particular concept that they are dealing with. An exit ticket will show that they have fully mastered it through their guided practice work and through the independent practice work. And then they can move to another level of learning.
I'm hoping in the next episode, we'll probably be able to show an exemplar exit ticket for some of these things that we talk about, so that it's clearer to our audience what we mean by these things.
Yeah. So another typical example is just the thumbs up, right? That students, and these goes with like what people talk about chorus answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this chorus answers should have a procedure that everybody should give you an answer, right?
Yeah.
So they will just not say the answer, but they will indicate that they got it right or they understand it. So by thumbs up. And if
Or
it
they
doesn't
agree
go
with the
well,
statement.
exactly. And if it's not going well for them or they have not learnt it, they show that by thumbs down.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there are several ways that teachers.
And they do the middle one where they are not sure, where they do the sideways.
Sideways. Yeah. That means that they get it, but they don't get it fully.
Yeah.
There's some muddy points that needs to be resolved for them so that the understanding can be clear for them. So these are just samples ways of checking understanding, but there are tons of ways that teachers do. You can ask all students to put their hands down. And then only those who don't know the answer to questions actually raise their hands. That could be another approach. Or all who can answer the question correctly should raise their hands. And the others will put their hands down. So, but you have to be mindful of making sure that you are creating a classroom environment that is responsive as you use each of these methods. So that every child feels belong, feels cared for within the learning environment. Positive emotions is very key for meaningful learning. And whilst we are applying any of these tools, we need to be mindful of that as well.
All right, Kwesi, thank you very much. Let's summarize the presentation then. In a summary, what would you say we need to be doing, we need to consider as we are presenting students or presenting to students?
All right, so I think that we can learn from successful or effective teachers. And one thing that you can see with effective teachers is that they spend more time, in guided practice.
Yes.
They spend more time asking questions, and they spend more time checking for understanding as well as correcting students' errors. So it is clear here that by just telling somebody that osmosis is this and this and that, without really showing them with examples or with a diagram what osmosis really looks like, doesn't mean that you have instructed that person effectively. Right? And if you have not checked whether that person has fully understand what osmosis is and what is always true about osmosis, for something to be called osmosis, the critical features that will always make it true, or for something to be called photosynthesis, what should always be true about it, without using concrete examples and visuals for the person to see it, and using assessment for learning tools to check the students' understanding of it, and identifying any known errors and correcting them, then you have not really instructed anybody in a way that will result in learning. You were just talking, and that is not teaching. Talking is not teaching. Teaching is talking, doing, and listening. And that is present, module, and then check whether the learning has happened. And once you do all of this, you will be enabling learning meaningfully for every child in your classroom.
All right. Thank you very much. My takeaway is that teaching is not talking, but teaching, especially in terms of direct instruction, is presenting, is modeling, and then checking for understanding. I know there's a lot to be done in this, and there will be a part 2 to this, where we look at some other practical ways of doing presentation. And once we are able to do that, we hope that educators who are our audience are going to take on board these practices to enhance direct instruction so that in the end, students' learning will be improved. We thank you for joining us today in our session on direct instruction. We hope to see you next week, same time. And we hope to see that gradually we all work together to transform learning in our various institutions that we find ourselves in. Thank you all for your time, and thank you, Kwesi. Hope to see you next week.